Why do most people trying to quit alcohol give up around day 3 or 4? The early days of stopping alcohol are driven by specific biological changes happening inside the brain. Multiple systems shift at once, and the result is some of the most uncomfortable days a person can experience. But those same systems follow a predictable timeline, and that timeline has a turning point. Understanding exactly when that turning point happens and why reveals something important about how the brain rebuilds itself and why the people who make it there describe a completely different experience. Most people who try to quit drinking give up around day 3 or 4. So what is actually happening inside the brain that makes those days so difficult? Alcohol doesn't just affect one system. It forces the brain to rebuild multiple systems around it. Dopamine drops, the calming system weakens, the excitatory system rises, stress hormones increase, sleep breaks down. Think of it like a thermostat that has been reset. The brain recalibrates everything around the presence of alcohol. Because alcohol is no longer an exception, it has become the expected condition. The brain is doing exactly what it is designed to do: adapt to the environment it is consistently exposed to. So when alcohol is removed, the brain doesn't return to normal immediately. It overshoots in the opposite direction. GABA is suppressed. Glutamate surges. The nervous system becomes hyperactivated. That is why the first few days feel so unstable, not because something is wrong, but because the brain is compensating for a substance that is no longer there. That's why those first few days feel so overwhelming. But here's what most people don't know. The same biology that makes those early days so difficult also sets a very specific clock for when things begin to change. For most people, the turning point begins somewhere between day 5 and day 7, and the first thing that shifts is not what most people expect. It isn't energy, it isn't motivation, it's stability. The GABA-glutamate balance begins to normalize. The brain is no longer locked in a hyper-excited state. At the same time, cortisol starts to drop. Sleep is still imperfect, but the body begins staying asleep longer. REM cycles start to stabilize. That low-level hum of anxiety that has been present since day 1, the feeling of being constantly on edge, begins to quiet. This is the moment many people describe the same way. Something feels different. Not dramatically better, but noticeably more stable. And that stability changes how the brain processes cravings. Earlier, cravings feel urgent and uncontrollable. As the brain stabilizes, that urgency weakens. The craving doesn't disappear, but it loses the intensity that makes it feel impossible to ignore. It becomes something that can be observed, rather than something that takes over. That shift from being controlled by a craving to simply noticing one is a significant neurological change, not just a mental one. So what is actually happening to the brain's reward system during this window? Dopamine begins to recover. Not fully, that process takes weeks, but enough that small things start to carry some reward again. A conversation feels a little easier. A walk feels less forced. Focus begins to return in small increments. These are not dramatic changes, but they signal something important. The brain is no longer running at a deficit. It is beginning to function on its own again. It is worth understanding why dopamine dropped in the first place. Alcohol triggers a dopamine release far above what the brain would produce naturally. Over time, the brain compensates by reducing its own dopamine output and lowering the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. It is trained to maintain balance. When alcohol is removed, that suppressed dopamine system doesn't instantly bounce back. It recovers gradually, but the recovery is real, and it follows a consistent pattern. Before the turning point, the brain is fighting the absence of alcohol. After it, the brain is adapting to life without it. That shift changes everything, because the hardest part of stopping isn't simply the absence of the substance. It's the window where the brain hasn't caught up yet. Once it begins to catch up, even partially, the process becomes sustainable in a way it simply wasn't before. This is why the first week matters so much more than most people realize. The biology doesn't care about willpower. It follows a timeline, and that timeline has a specific structure. Over the following weeks, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making and impulse control, begins to regain function. Sleep continues to deepen. Dopamine continues to rise toward baseline. The brain becomes more predictable, more regulated, and more capable of managing itself without external input. Research on alcohol recovery consistently shows that the brain retains a significant capacity for neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire and reorganize. The changes that occur during heavy drinking are not necessarily permanent. Regions that were suppressed begin to reactivate. Connections that were disrupted begin to rebuild. The timeline varies from person to person, but the direction of change, given enough time, tends to be consistent. But none of that happens if the process stops before the turning point arrives. The people who get there don't necessarily have more willpower. What they often have is a clear understanding of what the brain is doing and why the discomfort of the early days is temporary in a very specific biological sense. The brain that feels unmanageable on day 3 is not broken. It's following a precise biological sequence, and the moment it starts to feel easier is the moment that sequence begins to reverse. The same systems that were working against you start working with you, not because of willpower, but because the brain has finally caught up.